Hello everyone, this is Remlays from 40k Theories, and welcome to the March 2022 edition of the Patreon Q&A sessions. As always, if you would like your questions answered, then click the link in the video description below and help support the channel by becoming a patron. Now, let's jump into the questions. Voice of the Emperor asks, can orcs get fat? Yes they can, there's actually been 2 documented instances at the very least. One instance is from the 2nd edition Orc Codex where it says that the Baboons, the most wealthy of the Orc clans, like to spend their teeth on food, so many Baboon orcs are quite fat. Another example is shown within the book Xenology, because the orc in that book is described as being morbidly obese, and it's obese because it doesn't get a chance to fight, so basically if an orc eats a lot or has a sedentary lifestyle, it will get fat. Griffin of Might asks, what would happen if a Psyker who was found to be exceptionally powerful, and typically on the level wanted for a Grey Knight, was found to be incompatible with augmentation? There are 2 main possibilities in this regard. The first of which is that they get selected to become trained up as an Inquisitor, because many Inquisitors are in fact psychic. The other possibility is that they are deemed to be too great of a potential threat, so they get a bullet in the back of the head. There is a potential possibility that they could be trained up as a Primaris Psyker for the Astra Militarum, but someone on the level of a Grey Knight will typically be selected to be sidelined for an Inquisitorial role if they can't be made into a Space Marine. Besides the Assassins, Astartes, and Glam Warriors, what other types of augmentation are there in the Imperium? Well, the most common form of augmentation to be found within the Imperium is that of cybernetic augmentation, because many people throughout the Imperium, particularly in the armed forces like the Astra Militarum, and quite prominently in the Adeptus Mechanicus of all things, they all have like limbs replaced with cybernetic prostheses, like bionic eyes fitted, bionic fingers. I think there's actually been one case of bionic teeth in one instance at the very least, like metal teeth. So that would be the most common form of augmentation to be found, because biological and surgical augmentation, that has a lot of inherent risks that cybernetic augmentation does not have, things like organ rejections and stuff like that. And while cybernetic limbs can be rejected by the body, it seems to be less prominent than, say, in regards to organ transplant, stuff like that. Can an abhuman have a child with a normal human? I did an entire video on that topic several years ago, so go check that out. Samurai of the Emperor asks, what is Enuncia? To grossly oversimplify, Enuncia is a warp-based language. It's basically like words of power, like magical incantation, that kind of thing. There isn't too many books that go into that in detail. I know the Beckwith novels do, even though I haven't read them, and it is touched on briefly in the Siege of Terror series, where it's revealed that the Tower of Babel had Enuncia involved in some capacity, so check those books out if you want to know more. Lucanron asks, do you still feel somewhat hostile towards Gilmans' return? No, I've actually softened to it quite a bit. When it was first announced that Gilman was coming back, I was, not very happy about it. I was like, fucking really? Gilman of all people, for God's sake? But then, when you stop and think about it, if you had to bring a Loyalist Primarch back, Gilman made the most sense purely on the basis that he was the only Primarch where anyone actually knew where he was at any given time. Because Sanguinius, dead. Ferrus Manus, dead. Rogel Dawn, presumed dead. Vulcan, presumed dead. Corax, in the warp. Russ, in the warp. Jagatai, presumed to be in the webway. Lionel Johnson, alive, but hidden in the rock, and only the Watchers in the Dark know where he is. Gilliman in a stasis field, entombed upon the crag at the moment of his death, and his stasis pod had been turned into a shrine. So he was the most logical choice, all things considered, and I have softened to his return a bit. How about the Lion's return if that were to happen as you might have prophesized? I wouldn't necessarily be too adverse to Lionel Johnson returning, purely because he is the only other Primarch confirmed to still be alive on the Loyalist side, so if another Loyalist Primarch does come back, he does make the most sense. Personally though, I hope they don't bring back any Loyalist Primarchs for a good long time, if they have to do so at all. Mainly because if you keep bringing Loyalist Primarchs back, it kind of devalues, the whole impact of Gilliman's return. Because Gilliman's return was such a huge monumental deal about the fact, hey, a Loyalist Primarch is back. That's a huge deal, and it was like pretty much one of the main focal points of 8th edition. But if you keep bringing back Loyalist Primarchs, it's going to get to the point of like, cool, he's back, who's next? and that just kind of cheapens the whole thing, I feel. How do you really feel about this current setting of a Primarch? Is it in general good or bad if you were really made to choose? Honestly, at this point now I'm kind of indifferent, but that's probably because I'm just, well, used to the fact that our Loyalist Primarch is now back. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still a huge deal, but it's not as huge a deal as it was back at the tail end of 7 and at the beginning of 8. It's still a huge deal, don't get me wrong, but I guess we're just used to it now, aren't we? So, yeah. Baronium asks, could the Necrons have created the Enslavers as Old One/Eldari killers? I find it unlikely because Enslavers are beings that are native to warp space, and warp space is in itself completely anathema to the Necron race, so it would have to involve them in developing a huge understanding of the warp itself and how it functions to create something that's able to inhabit the warp, I feel. So I don't feel they would have been able to create them personally. It looks like that the Enslavers are just a quirk of evolution. With Gilman being the only Primarch available, is he offering up Gene Seed to create even more Ultramarines? This I don't think has actually been explicitly clarified. I would imagine that the Adeptus Mechanicus would love to get fresh genetic material from Gilman to create, fresh supplies of stable Gene Seed. I think that would be a prudent action for them to do. But I don't think it's been explicitly stated anywhere, but if you know for certain, please let me know in the comments below. Does Gilman feel guilty about being effectively the new War Master and being the antithesis of his Codex Astartes breakdown into chapters? Well, he's not so much a War Master, he's the Imperial Regent, even though he is Lord Commander of the Imperium. If anything, he's got a role that's more akin to Malcador the Sigillite, being the Regent of Terra. I suppose technically you could argue that his role is both, Malcador's and Horus's combined into one, but I digress. Gilman may feel guilt about it, but at the same time he's a very practical and pragmatic individual, so he may just go about thinking like, I don't agree with doing this, but I'm doing it because I have no choice kind of thing. Pentadeuce asks, do rogue traders still discover new worlds that humanity colonized in the Dark Age, or are those few and far between? I would imagine they still do so, even if it is a rare occurrence these days, but I imagine they still do so, yeah. Zero Hits asks, is it confirmed that the Adeptus Custodians are all made from human males and that none of them are female? Off the top of my head, I actually can't remember if it's ever been stated that they're all male. I need to double check that actually. I mean, given that the process for creating a Custodian is vastly different from that of creating a Space Marine, with no surgical alteration done at all, considering it's all done, by magic essentially, biological alchemy. I would imagine it's theoretically possible to create both male and female Custodians, but at the same time, all the Custodians we've ever seen are male, all the named Custodians at the very least. But yeah, I need to double check if it's actually been stated anywhere. Chief Surgeon asks, how are you feeling today? Don't ask. Don't ask. May I ask for a shout out for my 29th birthday? You absolutely can. Happy birthday, Chief Surgeon. Hope you have a great day. Hope you get lots of wonderful gifts and spend lots of time with the people you love. And finally, Austin Horner asks, spoilers for Twice Dead King Reign and the Infinite and the Divine. I've not read the Infinite and Divine, but screw it, I'll go ahead anyway. In Twice Dead King Reign, the Necron Cryptek Amhet, the Warlock of Canatite, is described as being heavily physically modified to the point of more resembling a Catan shard rather than a Necron, i.e. having a singularity for a core. With this, and with Auric and the Diviner's transformation at the end of the Infinite and the Divine, again which I've not read, so I'm just going to skip over this little tiny bit to reach the end of the question, do you think it's possible for a combination of these methods for Necrons to, for lack of a better term, ascend into beings akin to the Catan? Well, one thing that's important to note about the Necrons is that they are a purely mechanical race, and from a practical standpoint, it's a lot easier to modify and upgrade a mechanical body than it is a biological one. So, in theory, there's nothing to prevent the idea of a Necron Lord or a Cryptek, for example, modifying their bodies to become more powerful. And given that Necron technology is, effectively magic in its own right, there's nothing to theoretically stop a Necron from becoming godlike in power just from technological upgrades alone, from a Necron standpoint. So, it is potentially possible, but whether you'll see that in practice, I don't think you'll see the entire race undergo such an apotheosis, for lack of a better term, but maybe with certain individuals you certainly could, in theory. but in practice it's an altogether different matter. And that concludes this edition of the Patreon Q&A sessions. As always, if you would like your questions answered, click the link in the video description below and help support the channel by becoming a patron. Until next time, this has been Remlace from 40k Theories, and we'll see you again soon. Bye bye!